I'd like to welcome everybody. I'm Bentley Allen. I'm Research Director of Industrial Policy at the Transition Accelerator. We're really excited to have you all with us today for a discussion about international best practices for industrial policy. I'm going to kick us off and introduce our panelists. So this is another episode of the Transition Accelerator webinar series, which is designed to prompt and frame really meaningful discussions and strategic debates about the most important topics to how the world is going to create a net zero emission system, the one that we need for 2050, and to avoid the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. So we'd really like to welcome you to this series and to check out our website and sign up for the newsletter so that you can get more events like this. We also want to take a moment to acknowledge the land and the historical legacies of colonialism that we benefit from. The Transition Accelerator, with its staff across many provinces, as a virtual organization, acknowledges the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples on which we work and live, and we recognize and respect the ongoing relationships that Indigenous people have to the land, and we commit to the ongoing process of reconciliation. And invite you all to have your own reflection on that colonial history as part of this opening. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our two experts. We're still waiting on one of them, but I'll introduce them both. So first, here joining us is Dr. Olga Makieva, who is the Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at the University of College London, where she leads work on state investment banks and financial governance of the green transition. She also works to coordinate the research area on monetary economics, finance, and financial institutions at the European Association of Evolutionary Political Economy. And she's also served as the member-elect of the council there. She's acted as a coordinator of the Economics of Innovation Working Group at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, Young Scholars Initiative, which is doing really great work to create new economic paradigms, and has also worked in policy evaluation and advisory field as a senior expert in the Technopolis Group. And she's a leading thinker on industrial policy and especially the financial aspects of industrial policy, and we're really honored to welcome Olga here today. And our other guest, which hopefully will be along momentarily, is Dr. Tilman Altenberg. He's head of the Department of Transformation, Economic and Social Systems at the German Institute for Development and Sustainability, which is the German think tank for development policy. And Dr. Altenberg has had a long history conducting research and doing leading thinking in the areas of competitiveness, industrial and innovation policy, the promotion of small and medium-sized enterprises, and value chain development. He serves as a frequent advisor to the German government and to international development agencies on industrial policy. So these are two really excellent voices in this space, and we're really glad that they've agreed to have this conversation with us here today. So we're going to kick it off with Olga, who is going to provide a few minutes of comments, and then we'll dive into a little discussion amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up to the floor as soon as we can. So please, Olga.
Thank you, Bentley. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon for me. I'm very glad to be here, so thanks for inviting, and I'm glad to discuss all things industrial policy and the green transition. I would like perhaps to start with a sort of very macro, broader view, is that I think I would like to emphasize that future-oriented industrial policy for green, just, and sustainable future should be viewed as a structural transformation, as a structural change. Therefore, that implies constant change and constant dynamics. And of course, here, the role of public policy and public sector is very important. Then imagine if we make political goal the green and structural transformation, and not the green industrial policy for the sake of green industrial policy. And if we politically commit to green, just structural transformation, then all sorts of questions come to mind. Things become very complex and messy very fast. But it also sparks this broad political commitment, would also spark political and collective imagination. It would also immediately go beyond tax credits, or certainly beyond let's say $56 million, which I understand is an important number in Canada this spring. It will also go beyond $400 billion, which is a important number in the United States. So what I'm saying is that the conversation we'll get when we talk about structural transformation towards green economy and society, of course, conversation gets more complex and even more sophisticated, if I may. And then we can, from that point of view, we will not talk about whether tax credits are good or bad, or what is their impact or effect within the green industrial policy conversation, but we will talk about their effects vis-a-vis, first, the overall goal of structural green transformation, number one, and number two, vis-a-vis other policy tools, such as R&D investments, credit lines to green sectors, public procurement, you name it. Another question that comes immediately to mind is the question of governance and public sector capacities. And I would like to also maybe draw a fast parallel with a conversation about, or examples of successful and proactive industrial policies after Second World War II, because very often these experiences are brought as examples of successful industrial policy into today's conversations, how to go about green industrial policies. But of course, we cannot do the same policies as we did in the 60s and 70s. But there is one lesson maybe I would like to bring into today's conversation is that of deliberately investing in public sector organizations. And there were and remain some examples of countries where this becomes an integral part of industrial innovation strategy and economic planning. So that was my first point. And the second point is about finance. I think I would like to bring that topic as well into today's conversation in a way that how to make sure that financial policies at various levels, they actually serve the goals of structural transformation. We can talk about investments, fiscal, monetary, regulatory, all sorts of ranges and policy tools that can be activated, but how to make sure that they work to the end of the industrial and transformation with the green strings attached. So that would be my second point, and I'm happy to I'm happy to come back to those points and talk about some examples today. Bentley, over to you.
Thank you, Olga, for a great start. And I think the message that what we're dealing with here is a structural transformation, and that we need to think systematically about how all the tools on the table are contributing to that structural transformation is a really a critical point, and one that we're here to spend some time really digging into today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Tillman, who I've already introduced. And so we're welcome to have your comments.
Yeah, thank you very much, and sorry for being late. There was a timing issue here, but anyway, here I am, and happy to contribute, and great to be here, and it's a big honor to have been invited to this wonderful seminar here. So what I'm going to say firstly is a bit about green industrial policy. Why is it needed? I mean, industrial policy has in the past often be criticized. Governments should not pick winners. I think you're probably all familiar with these sentences. And essentially market forces would ensure that firms react to changing environment. And of course, there's some truth in it, but lots of things are also wrong about this. Firstly, because there's a lot of market failure, and especially if we talk about not any transformation from typewriters to computers or whatever are market-driven processes. Here we are talking about, when we talk about a green transformation, we're talking about something where science tells us we need to change the way of doing things. We need to change our energy system. We need to change our transport systems, the way we do agriculture and so on, the way we do housing, urban planning, etc. And these are very much policy driven, and markets don't deliver these things necessarily. Firstly, because lots of environmental costs are obviously not taken into account unless firms are forced to do so. Then you could say as an economist, okay, then let's introduce a carbon price. And that I mean, even if a carbon price that's high, that really reflects the true price of global warming, then you would have an incentive. And that's definitely a smart thing to do, a necessary thing to do, but it still does not replace industrial policy because there are lots of coordination failures. Let's imagine you want to move from combustion engines to electric vehicles. No car maker produces an electric vehicle unless there's a charging infrastructure. No energy utility invests in charging infrastructure unless there are at least a few 100,000 electric cars on the road. And then you need to agree on standards, you need to agree on R&D, you need to ensure that battery supply chains are in place and all these things. So, and all the countries that have managed these transitions have coordinated. And that's what the key of industrial policy is about. And then this notion of picking winners, for me, that's entirely misleading because it evokes the picture of a kind of Soviet Union type of 5-year planning where a bureaucrat sits there and imposes unrealistic objectives on the business sector, right? So that's a bit what this picking winners thing. But that's not what modern industrial policy is about. It's about bringing business, it's about recognizing a necessary transition. For example, the energy systems, we need to move into green hydrogen, we need to move into low carbon steel making, etc., which are societal goals. And governments communicate and discuss these societal goals with stakeholders. Very importantly, of course, with the business, but also other stakeholders, to jointly define what kind of transition we want to have, what kind of mobility system of the future the society wants, and then how investments can be coordinated to ensure that the whole system works. And that's working with the business and also in a way that reduces risks for individual investors, because if you would not coordinate, then someone who in the automotive industry would produce electric cars and then maybe get stranded because there's no charging infrastructure. We had similar cases where offshore wind parks were developed, but then the evacuation infrastructure was not there in time, and then it took three years or so, and the investors in offshore wind parks lost all their investments, right? So that's what it is about. And then the second point I want to make is then essentially you can get things wrong, right? What's really not debatable is whether we need green industrial policy. What is debatable is how to do it. And many countries do it in the wrong way. And I think that should be the essence also of what we discuss here today. Because you can design industrial policy in such a way that you don't achieve the societal objectives, and you have lots of industries lobbying the government for subsidies that are really not necessary, right? So the art of the industrial policy in what one author has called the embedded autonomy, that is working with this private sector to really understand where markets fail, what companies would do, where you need to intervene, and where not. And then so working with the business, but without being captured by lobby interest, right? And that's a difficult thing. In that sense, and I would end my first intervention with that. In that sense, I'm not sure whether, for example, the American way of the Inflation Reduction Act, and I understand also Canada is emulating some of these very heavily subsidy-driven approaches, where I'm not sure whether that's the best way, whether you create economic rents here for big multinationals that are not really needed. And I think Olga touched upon some of these aspects already. So I think it's about smart packages, demand and supply side interventions, creating markets, changing consumer habits, creating R&D incentives, and not just entering a subsidy race for bringing the for taking all the investment costs of a battery manufacturer, for example, and paying it for it with taxpayers' money. I'll leave it at that, and I think we can deepen things and then come up with practical examples in a bit.
Yeah, that's a really great, really a tour of all of the major issues that we're hoping to cover over the course of our time together today. And I think that both of you, I think, are pointing to two things that I think we can just pull out right away, which is that one, that somehow the vision of that structural transformation has to be essential. But at the same time, what Tom and I see what you're saying is that we have to be able to co-define that vision and work together in order to design a set of policies and processes that will help us achieve that vision. And that these two things have to be working together at all times, both that an understanding that what we're doing here is structural transformation, and that we have to co-define our pathways to those structural transformations. And to do that well, we've got to design policies in a smart way rather than just deploying policies, especially not just only subsidies, and hoping that things work out. So I think the stage is set for a really good and rich conversation here from the opening remarks. Before we go into those thornier issues a little bit more deeply, what I want to first ask you both is if you have a favorite example of industrial policy. It doesn't even have to be green industrial policy, but if there's a favorite example of industrial policy, either currently in development or from the past, and what you think the lessons that are important to learn from that kind of specific historical example might be. And I'll go to Olga first here if something is jumping off the page for you.
Oh, that's that's not an easy one. I thought about two while you were formulating your question, Bentley. I would go to Norway and how they developed historically hydropower system of hydropower energy over 100 years ago. And that decentralization of energy sources also contributed to the regional development. I mean, Norway is a small country and it's full of rocks. So you have little settlements and villages and towns here and there. And of course, then you face simply for those reasons, the question of how to balance regional strategies and development. Of course, you also have very northern regions with the different conditions and very small populations. But so far, but I mean, that was the factor, one of the factors that were not intended, I think, with the focus of regional development. But it's a success story, and it also has what is fascinating that it took place over a century ago, and yet we can build our choices and industrial policy, innovation policy, regional policy choices based on that choices that were made 100 years ago. So this, for me, as a researcher and also as someone who's interested in the policy landscape, it's the continuation. Of course, we can make radical changes. We can reinvent the discourse. We can, of course, adapt our policy choices, but at the same time, there is a cumulative effect of the choices we make in a society or in a specific region over time. And of course, there could be wrong examples of making such choices. I think maybe I'll stop there. Other examples I think I wanted to bring from Southeast Asia, but there is just so much written on it. I just don't want to cite perhaps things that everyone knows. Maybe the city-state of Singapore that was so vulnerable and so small, but was so smart in investing deliberately in public sector capacities. And I had the chance to dig into that story a little bit. And that's really fascinating, going back to 50s and 60s. And again, this legacy still lives today, that very embedded thinking in the civil servants have to understand their area from the technical point of view. They need to understand corporations they work with, sometimes even better than the board directors that sit on those corporations boards. So that was another, perhaps that would be another inspiring story related to industrial policy.
Yeah, I'll just take the opportunity, since I'm the Canadian in the room here, to take a moment and just translate some of that to the Canadian context. So the Norwegian example, I think, is fascinating. And the way you described it as using hydropower to create a decentralized and therefore regional economic strategy, I think is a lesson that we really need to think strongly about in the Canadian context. We have a really big, geographically and ecologically diverse country in which the power systems and the electricity systems, and in fact, the whole energy system, as it transitions, is going to transition in different ways depending on which parts of the country that we're in. And so this regional mentality, and also thinking about the electricity sector itself as a kind of structural enabler for economic development, that insight, I think, is a really key one that we can take from the Norwegian example as well. So both treating electricity as the foundation of the strategy, and then also thinking about how we're going to develop regional strategies in a decentralized way. I think that's actually, those are both really critical lessons for Canada. And the Singapore lesson, I think, is great as well. Obviously, we're not a small island nation state. We're just the opposite, a giant landmass. But the state capacity point, I think, is really important because most of the Canadian public service has forgotten how to do industrial policy. There were concentrated, intentional industrial policies in Canada, but through the 1990s, those were dismantled during the era of the Washington Consensus, or what we might call neoliberalism. I think the idea that we should build up a public sector capacity in response to the green transition as a way of enabling industrial policy, I think is really helpful. Tillman, what are some of your favorite examples, and what are the lessons that we can learn from them?
Maybe two examples that are interrelated. One where Germany, I think, has performed well, where it totally lost track of an interesting development. What we have in Germany is a very corporatist culture in a way. So all these neoliberal waves of rejecting industrial policy, etc., we didn't have them here. So even under the most conservative and market liberal governments, we always had an industrial policy division in the Ministry of Economy, for example. We always had all these Fraunhofer institutes, etc., which are technology institutes, which are closely collaborating with industries on a sector-specific level, etc. And nobody has ever questioned that. So there have been the intellectual debates, and with different connotations and changes and paradigm shifts, and the practice has always been the same, more or less. But one thing, for example, the shift to electric vehicles, that was interesting because Germans had given up on battery manufacturing when the whole outsourcing started of the electronics industries from Europe and the US to Asia. The battery manufacturing capacities went to Asia with the electronics, right? And nobody cared about batteries until they found out that lithium is so powerful that you can have traction batteries for cars. And then the car industries was really waking up and said, what happens there? And we are really losing our competitive edge in our main industry. And then the government convened a process of accelerating the shift to electric vehicles. They built working groups. And what do we do about batteries? What do we do about mineral supply chains? What do we do about charging infrastructure? What about standards and regulations, and so on? And all these groups were industry-led, and they were coordinated by an office. There was a joint office of 4 different ministries: environment, transport, economy, etc. And they basically coordinated the process, but the process itself was very much private sector driven, but it also involved environmental organizations and all stakeholders, right? And then they came up with a plan, and it was revised, and it was put back to discussion, etc. So that's how embedded autonomy should work, and it worked pretty well. Then, for example, they had city trials, so with some regions where they tested things with one energy utility and one automotive companies in one big city with the mayor of that city, and another automotive company with another utility in another big city in Germany. So people got familiar and people tested, things were tested on the ground. And then they started a subsidy scheme. The subsidy scheme was not very environmental because you got subsidies for all sorts, big BMWs and Mercedes, as long as they are electric, which was not very environmental. But anyway, but it was good because it was a clear phasing out scheme. So it was announced from the very beginning. So we start subsidizing, but only two years or so to get the market going, and then we will reduce the subsidies again. So all these are the principles of what industrial policy should work like. Then another example where it was very interesting. It's very obvious that all big mega cities have an air pollution problem in the world. No, so you have particulate matters and people dying from it, and all the mega cities are polluted. And it's the easiest way, one of the very easy ways of changing this is electrifying bus fleets, right? But nobody cared in Europe about these things. Nobody cared in the US. Only the Chinese started in 2009 to address that system and to do something. We will electrify our bus fleets with a mix of regulatory instruments, just bans for diesel buses and so on, and R&D subsidies. And then they put Shenzhen as a star case and electrified the whole traffic systems, all buses, metros, all taxis within 10 years' time, right? And that the bus fleet in Shenzhen was bigger than the electric bus fleet in the rest of the world. And by that, they created champions, BYD, Yutong, different Chinese companies, and those are now exporting to Europe and to the US. What a shame for countries that have been traditional diesel bus makers and take a pride in moving towards green. And then basically all the big bus makers, Scania and Mercedes and whatever, are now competing with or cannot compete for the time being with offers from China, because the government did not subsidize the transition there, but it did not subsidize it here. The EU now started with a time lag of 10 years to catch up with the Chinese, right? So that's a lesson about timeliness of things and about that was such an obvious market opportunity, but it cost some subsidies, and nobody was willing to invest these subsidies. And those would be, for me, smart subsidies, because clearly they develop a new sector. It's a different subsidy from offering Volkswagen now to pay their battery investment, their battery manufacturing plant in Canada with taxpayers' money, because what's the technological learning in that for Canada? So that would be the difference for me.
That's great. And I think just there's so many things to pick up on in that comment. So the first thing I'll pick up on is the last point there, which is maybe thinking about what would be the bars for a good industrial policy. So just to pull out what was implicit in your comments there, which is that for you, a bar is that there's actually technological learning happening or a new industry that's getting created. Mm-hmm. If you're going to actually outlay large amounts of subsidies, you need to see the payoff in one of those forms. But paying subsidies to a large mature firm, for you, you wouldn't see that as having value. Is that right? Oh, you muted yourself, Tillman, there just before you started talking.
I couldn't agree more. I totally support your summary. Yeah. Mm.
On that, one of the arguments that gets made is that the battery factory will serve as an anchor, that it will basically provide the means for all of the component parts manufacturers and the rest of the battery supply chain going upstream to the mines and to the cathode active material and the anode active material, that all of that really depends on the investment in the battery factory. Are there insights in our understanding of cluster development or in creating innovation ecosystems that we could harvest if we wanted to make the most of that facility as it exists, knowing that the subsidy is not going to now be retracted? Or do you think that argument is weak, or how would you assess this anchor investment argument? Olga, if you have thoughts on that, we can start with you.
Olga, would you like to go first?
What?
Yes, please.
Yeah, just go ahead. No.
Go ahead, Tom. You muted yourself again.
Okay. I think it depends. If you really have an accompanying strategy for building the capabilities, then it may make sense, right? But I mean, what do you need to be a battery producer? I'm not in know a little bit about the sector, but I'm not really a specialist. But for a lithium battery, for example, you need chemistry above all. You need anode materials and cathode materials and separators and stuff. And then you need battery management systems, which is essentially about software and organizing the basically smart software that ensures there's a good interface between the car that uses the battery and the chemical processes in the battery, etc. No, so this is extremely specialized know-how, and it is in a few leading chemical companies, a few companies that are leading on membranes, etc. No, so the assumption we have a mine in Canada, and now pull in the battery factory. And then all the steps in between will emerge automatically. I think that is not likely to happen. No? So I think what you need, and I come back to embedded autonomy again, is making smart assumptions about what can be learned, how high, how complex are the entry barriers. No? In the battery manufacturing, I see many countries now in the global south, also Chile and South Africa and even Congo. They all think because they have minerals, they can move into battery manufacturing. No? And I promise you, these countries will fail because they don't have the technological expertise. No? So whether Canada can assemble that, I'm not sure. It may be. No. And there we don't want to have a bureaucrat picking winners and say we assume you can't, but the bureaucrats, the policymakers, should bring actors together and say, imagine we have bring in the battery factories, and then you discuss with the chemical companies in Canada, as though that are already existing, or with the investment promotion agencies, where that would make sense to bring those into Canada to build something like a class. So you need to understand the industry at the end of the day, and the technicalities behind the industries, and whether it is useful or whether it is promising to develop these value chains around it. And that's extremely sector specific, and it's probably easier if you bring in a textile company or so to produce cotton and yarn than battery manufacturing or chips manufacturing, for example, because the economies of scale, for example, for these gigafactories are so big that, for example, for South Africa, it's totally unimaginable to get a foot into that industry. No? So that's, I think you need to really work with the technical people and with the business people and see which kind of trajectories and pathways are promising and possible.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it brings us back to questions of state capacity, right? So you need to have a government that is able to formulate a strategy around these investments. So if you're going to use a foreign direct investment strategy, there has to be kind of a clear sense of what the technological learning component of the strategy is going to be and how to execute on that. And that requires deep technical knowledge of the industries themselves, and also deep technical knowledge of what the structural transformation is going to be. So Olga, I wonder if you have further thoughts on the lessons of how we can build state capacity and what it looks like to build state capacity, and how that's done over time and how it's maintained and how you invest in it, and these kinds of considerations that governments and policymakers need to be grappling with in order to design good industrial policy.
Yeah, thanks. I think 2 points. Following up on Tilman's intervention, I wanted to, if we talk about batteries, supercapacitors, these type of things. To me, the question of also rare materials come to mind. Political economy aspects are in the fact that, of course, a lot of materials, a lot of elements that are located in the global south are used for innovations that are owned by the companies of the global north, but let's park it there for a while. My point of saying this, of referring to rare materials, is that we think then about innovation and material use, in recovery of different metals and all type of things, recycling, whatever. All these are type of activities. And very often radical innovations that are really providing a breakthrough technological solutions, they actually happen outside of their supply chains. For example, if I am in the business of Coca-Cola and soda production, the likelihood that the radical innovation in the material use, or let's say using the production or recycling of that, let's say plastic bottles, will not happen in the retail soda industry. It will happen elsewhere. And so actually understanding that we need to talk about economic sectors, we need to talk about technology clusters, but we also have to be mindful that a lot of times those radical breakthroughs actually happen outside of those sectoral boundaries. And me, let's say, if I'm sitting somewhere in the ministry, somewhere in the department thinking about these things, well, again, how do I go about it? Like with whom do I call if I want to know more? So that again boils down to the second point, yes, to the capacities. The capacity to translate that complexity into holistic policy approach. Holistic, of course, I mean, we cannot, this is a universe, we have to make choices, but how to make those choices with more informed intention, more informed approach. That's, I think, the key question when talking about public organizations' capacities. I mean, what is good governance in that sense? What is good enough? What is good enough policy choices? So to me, the answer is like, well, they have to be informed at least. And then related to that, I would then emphasize, well, how do I coordinate? How do I coordinate my subsidies to car manufacturers that produce electric vehicles, and now how I can combine it in a coherent manner with support measures to phase out internal combustion engine? But again, how do I retrain people? How do I deal with saturating markets? How do I deal with the sunset clauses of supporting that type of industries? This is all, there is a lot of discretion of how to go about this. And this is not new. Back in history, that rapid industrialization drive, there were also two considerations. There were a very strong incentive and drive to promote new industries and new sectors, building them from scratch. At the same time, there was a need to suppress speculative and consumption-oriented sectors such as real estate and consumption, which is less productive for you if you want to drive structural change based on industrialization. You have limited resources. So in that sense, this dual challenge, I think, in a grand scheme of things, is not really new today, just that, of course, it has slightly different nature. And someone asked in the chat, what is the relevance of very old historical examples to today's Canada? Well, from my point of view, if, let's say, the question, relevant question in Canada to ask, what is the technological and economic potential of using hydrogen in greening steel production? This question can be asked in modern Canada, right? So if I want to understand what is this potential and what is a 10-year trend in such transformation, whom do I call? If I would like to have a number of interviews to understand national context in Canada on these particular questions, so whom do I talk? Where is this competence located? So that would be my answer to the question in the chat. What's the relevance of history to modern day?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, that we need to have these, we need to have experts on tap, and that we need to take a broader view. One of the things that just struck me about the comment that you just made, though, is that you were putting investment in the green transition within the context of investment in the overall economy. And so thinking about suppressing certain parts of the economy in order to benefit other parts of the economy, or thinking about the structure of investment looking across sectors is kind of something that is, first of all, hard to get our heads around, but also seems to be really critical for the green transition. So I wonder if you could expand on your comments on finance that you made up front, and tell us a little bit about what the challenge with industrial policy is vis-a-vis finance, and not just public finance, not just using public finance properly, but how we mobilize private finance to contribute to this. So how does industrial policy, or how can industrial policy mobilize and advance private finance in order to drive the structural transformation that we need? And I'll go to Olga first, and then I think Tillman will have comments on this topic as well.
Thanks, Bentley. Finance is a very big topic, of course. And I think by now there is quite a strong consensus that it's not about the quantity of finance. There is a lot of it out there. It's just about the type of finance that will serve the purposes of, and then, you know, insert whatever you want. Is it green industrial policy? Is it green transition? Is it more specific goal of using hydrogen for greening steel industry? It's about those qualitative, transformative targets that you make conscious choice about. And then the question is, okay, how do I organize the finance, both public and private, to serve, to enable that? So of course, finance alone is not amount of money that will that will solve all the problems. It's the quality and the type of money and funding. And of course, if we go back into the history and look at the industrialization policies, on a kind of abstract level, on the macro level, the problems of designing investment strategies into new economic sectors is not really new. It's just that the sectors were different and the considerations were different. Today, the question still remains, if I am a public authority at the national, local level, what type of institutions I think will enable me to design first conditionalities to enable time horizons and timeframes that would allow for my industrial policy goals to materialize? What is also my internal capacity to monitor, negotiate, deliberate, and also assume certain failures, because we have to be straight about certain projects and certain technologies will not evolve the way we thought they would. How do we deal with what Mariana, the director of our institute, how do we deal with the risk rewards formula? So there are many, many questions about finance. I think I like to talk about public financial institutions, state investment banks, because I do think, and a lot of colleagues at the institute think that they are kind of underutilized. To have one is not enough. And there are so many ways and a range of options how you can go about and use these institutions in a very strategic way. And of course, there are many examples in history how this was done. So perhaps my answer to your question would be that the good news is that there are multiple ways of organizing finance and working with the private finance interests. But you have to also another good but also challenging news is that you really have to be prepared. Again, the question of capacity. How do you negotiate with private investors, not only to convince, but to make a business case that, okay, you have to go there. What kind of policy levers you use for that? So that's, I think, the main question. And it's not the amount of finance again. I think it's not the primary question.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to encourage our audience members to put your questions in the chat. We're going to turn to the audience questions just after Tillman's response. So I'll start to feather those in to our conversation in just a moment. So Tillman, comments on this thread of argument.
On the finance part. I just had a meeting today we had a workshop now with an investor who's producing green ammonia in Namibia. And Namibia is an unbeatable location because of solar and wind resources that are really unparalleled in the world almost. So the cost of producing ammonia technically is like 30% lower than anywhere else. And it's a $10 billion euro investment that they are now planning. And the big thing, and it's about port infrastructure, it's about renewable energy, wind parks, solar parks, electrolyzers, the whole infrastructure, a whole region, a whole city will be turned around there. The key thing is finance, because the cost of finance in Namibia is higher. There's a country risk and so on. And the whole operation is so capital intensive that the capex and opex cost is basically eating up the 30% margin that Namibia has in terms of resource endowment, right? So it's essentially a question of really de-risking investments, of providing new ways. There was, and another panelist we had in that same panel today was someone from H2 Global. That's a financial instrument that Germany created, which is a tendering system where they buy green. The idea is it's a heavily funded government scheme to get the global hydrogen market going, because green hydrogen is in huge demand, but there's a hen and egg problem. There's no production yet that is competitive. So they're encouraging projects as off-takers. So they say we make a tender for certain amounts of green hydrogen, and we buy from the lowest cost suppliers, and then we have a second tender where we sell it on to industry, and the government pays the difference in a way. So they created a special, and that's an interesting smart mechanism, because you have a clear market failure here. So we want to decarbonize. I mean, Olga mentioned the steel industry, for example. And this other question about who do I call if we want to decarbonize the steel industries. And that shows the complexity of the thing, because it's policy driven at the end of the day. The steel industry doesn't decarbonize for fun, but because there are EU-wide regulations, for example, and roadmaps for phasing out. And then there are company targets, and they need to scale up green hydrogen, but the green hydrogen is not there. The steel companies cannot do it themselves. And whether the cost of green steel then depends on the development of an electrolyzer industry, which is not yet existing. And that depends on the development of ammonia tank vessels, which are not yet existing. So you have lots of coordination failures again, and industry needs to plan. And you need to bring all these stakeholders together if you want to get that kind of economies going, right? So yeah, that's again a matter of coordination and eliciting information from market actors. There's no other way of doing it.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great vivid example, and a great example of where we're at in the transition and how we can use innovative and interesting tools to solve the problem. And of course, in Canada, there's a hope that we have ammonia projects on the east coast of Canada that will be able to feed into the exact same scheme that you just mentioned. So this is another action point for Canadian industrial policy, actually, is to help de-risk the actual build out of those renewable energy resources on the east coast of Canada, so that they can be integrated into that global ammonia market as it emerges. But of course, it's not cost competitive with ammonia as it currently exists, and so there's this fundamental investment problem that has to be resolved somehow. So that's great. I'm going to start bringing in questions from the audience, but before I do that, I just want to take a moment to kind of say how rich our discussion is, and that we can only really scratch the surface of these issues. And we're going to take the conversation away and make a list of the kind of best practices that we've already gone through, and some of the lessons that we think that are on the table here today. But also just to say that this conversation needs to keep going. And so really at the Transition Accelerator, we're seized of that. And what we'd like to announce to everybody today is that we're launching a new center as well to work on these issues. And so we're going to put in the chat here a link to our website, the Center for Net Zero Industrial Policy. And for the attendees that are in the audience, you can go to the website, you can sign up for the newsletter, and that'll be the place where we offer the kinds of insights and digestions that we're having in the conversation here today. And the center will really act as a place where both researchers and practitioners can meet to work through these kinds of issues at a practical level in Canada, and really try to distill the lessons learned that we are talking about here, and really turn them into action in the Canadian context, for the exact reasons that we're having this discussion here today. So you can check that out at netzeroindustrialpolicy.ca, sign up for our newsletter, check out our resources there. And we're going to add the links that we've been putting today to our resources page, actually, which is full of really great stuff on green industrial policy. And there's also links to our already existing work already up on the website. And if you're a researcher and you're interested in getting in touch, do use the Contact Us tab on that if you're interested in being involved in the research of the center. So now I'd like to turn to some of the audience questions for Olga and Tillman to respond to. So we have two questions about the IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a really big topic of conversation here in Canada. And Tillman, you mentioned it in your comments. And I just wondered if we could put the IRA in the frame of what we would consider to be like best practices industrial policy. So what is it about the IRA itself that falls short of that? And what are maybe some of the other things that happening in the United States that maybe already are doing some of the other elements of what we need in industrial policy, or what else would be needed in order to really think through the IRA as industrial policy? Your views as leading European experts are also welcome on whether you think the IRA is good for the globe as a whole, because this is obviously an area of active debate where some folks think that it's great, and other folks think that it's leading a race to the bottom, or that it's causing problems in some way. And so your views on those issues are really welcome here. So we'll start with Tillman, and then we'll go to Olga.
Okay, I'm not familiar with all the details of the IRA, but essentially what my critical point there is that it's very much leaning towards subsidies for multinationals and relatively little to R&D and local capability building and clustering and all the things that modern innovation policy is about. And at least there, I would say there's a strong imbalance. And of course, it's in a way good to have lots of money flowing into these things rather than things that we don't want to see. I mean, rather than investing the same amount of money into fossil fuel technologies or whatever. So clearly we need to have an investment push. And if we unleash a kind of international subsidy race, and that's what's happening. I think Canada is trying to outcompete US, and Europe is then trying to catch up with the US and Canada, and in Europe it's probably only Germany and France that are really able to provide the kind of resources, and then we don't really have an international level playing field in a way. No, so we basically the country that gets most taxpayers to subsidize multinationals wins the race at the end of the day. And that then is basically a beggar thy neighbor policy that doesn't benefit anyone at the or that may benefit the country that at the end gets the chip factory or the battery factory. But it comes at a very high cost. So I think in principle you would not need these batteries. No? So the race is basically a race of who pays more taxpayers' money to companies that don't need it. No? So that's difficult. It's also unfair from a global perspective. I mean, the better option would be if we say we need. I mean, decarbonization, for example, is a human challenge. It's a challenge for humanity, and we need to scale these things up. No? And then we take the same amount of money that all the big nations now put into subsidizing investments of multinationals and say, let's do kind of technology mission internationally to speed things up. No, then I think it would be a much better use of the money, because it wouldn't totally distort the international environment. No? And I think attracting a multinational is not what builds capacity. I mean, I voiced my opinion on that early. So at least I think it's an incomplete agenda for those countries that do these things. And then one thing before I hand over to Olga, there may be a difference between technologies. If you say like green hydrogen, which is not yet existing, and we really need to have big investments in something that we need to scale up, but the technology is clearly not mature, and that's why it deserves lots of public subsidization. That's different from something where you have already dozens of big factories like lithium battery factories, for example, where the market has developed, the technology is mature, and that makes even less sense, I would say.
Great. Olga.
Well, my comment on the IRA, despite its huge size, I don't know, 400 billion of, let's say, support measures, my comment towards that would be, well, isn't it just top of the iceberg? And the iceberg is that the United States has been practicing industrial policy in a quotation mark in some sort of discrete way, I think for a very long time. Which again, I don't want to overuse the word capacity, but it has been there. And there are also agencies that have institutional memory. Think of DARPA, think of ARPA-E, a lot of those golden success stories that are celebrated as, and you know, a lot of countries would like, and academics look at it with also great interest. How did they do it and how to emulate? But the question is that, of course, I would like to rephrase perhaps or redirect. It's not about IRA. What is the what Canada's heart desires in terms of what is that? What is the starting point? What is the goals of the green transition? What is the internal challenges, societal challenges from the technology point of view, from the industrial point of view? From where Canada's firms, how are they positioned in the global supply chains? Would you like to see them changing those positions? You know, how do you see it in a 10-year time, 20-year time? Where would you like to go as a country, as a certain sector, as a certain technology, visionary, that when you are in Canada? That would be my question. It's not so much about IRA. IRA is one way of doing things, but it's also very contextual. It's one way of doing things given how things have been done in the United States. So what is the way of doing things in Canada, and what would be then the goals? Because they necessarily have to be Canada specific.
Yeah, I think that's great and really helpful. And I also like the point that the IRA is not the sum total of the U.S. industrial policy. So as you pointed out, there's a long tradition of like first and early stage innovation policy in the United States, and there's also even since 2008, the Loan Program Office, which is focused on the commercialization of technologies in the space between that early stage innovation and full commercialization, and that has, of course, been supercharged by the IRA, but it was already in place. And further, there are these, to get to your point about sitting down, making a strategy, figuring out what it's going to be like in this Canadian context. You know, the Department of Energy has been leading strategies and roadmaps in 20-some sectors for a number of years now. So the IRA was already intervening into a set of strategic operations that were ongoing within the Department of Energy. And so it's not, I don't think, an ideal industrial policy from like the standard East Asian model, in the sense that there's not like real competitive sector tables that really sit down and try to hash this out through formal coordination mechanisms. But there are some really interesting examples there, and actually what the DOE is doing in the automotive sector looks a lot like the European Battery Alliance, creating a public-private partnership that serves as an intermediary between government and industry, and as a space where government and industry can meet in order to really coordinate on strategy and lead, just as they did in the European Battery Alliance. So there are some coordination mechanisms that I think are actually being set up. So we have another question from the audience, which is on those coordination mechanisms. And Tillman, earlier we were talking about embedded autonomy. So I wonder if either one of you, Tillman, if you'd like to do it, that would be great. Just define what embedded autonomy is, and then talk about what ideal kinds of coordination mechanisms might be. And then maybe if you have an example of like a gold standard, this is Travis's question, of what those coordination mechanisms might be that we could learn some lessons from. Tillman, you can start.
Should I go first? Yes.
Yeah.
Gold standard is difficult. I mean, when I gave this example of the electric vehicle transition, I think that was, I think, a very, very good example of that. So it's about working with the firms that have all the technical expertise and working with the, and also having institutions like, for example, in Germany, we have Fraunhofer Institutes, which are technology institutes. There are probably 50 institutes, and they're very specialized on battery chemistry. And there's a Fraunhofer Institute on solar PV, and there's one on whatever. So you name it. So you have, and the solar one has more than 1,000 researchers probably, you know. And so you have really expertise in the university system, or kind of, it's not a university. Their way of working is very much incentivized to work with the private sector also. And then you have these formats and the trust building process with the private enterprise, and the ministries don't need to have expertise. But they need to be able to have think tanks, etc., to identify where the expertise is and bringing it together and then converting that into roadmaps. And maybe a negative example, I saw there was one comment also on after the energy transition and the experience with nuclear energy. And that for me is the opposite example of where Germany got it totally wrong. And what Germany did, there was after the energy crisis, before the energy, in the 1960s, invested lots and lots of money into nuclear energy. There's never been such a big technology mission in Germany as for the nuclear energy at that time. There was all public investment. Then the technology was taken by big companies and rolled out, and they produced nuclear power plants. They ran it with a huge profits, but the whole thing about the nuclear waste was basically outsourced to the public. So all the risks were then socialized again. All the profits were privatized. All the risks were socialized. Then we had the nuclear disaster in the Ukraine. And then the government said they wanted to phase out the nuclear power plants and paid huge indemnizations to the nuclear plants. Then there came a change in governments, and they said we had a conservative government, and that said let's extend the nuclear power plant usage another 10 years. And then they paid them for ramping it up again. And then we had Fukushima in Japan, next disaster, and the government change. And we had a second phase out, and again the industry became bailed out essentially. You know, so we paid like 5 times to the industry. All the profits were privatized, all the costs were socialized. And you could see that, for example, the state secretaries that did these deals were in the conservative government for a while. Then when the government changed it, they took lobbying positions in the nuclear energy. And then the next phase went back as state secretaries. So that's embedded autonomy, but in a way that clearly captured rents, right? So it's an example of how you get things wrong. No?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's so important to maintain that independence. And like you said, the Fraunhofer Institutes being outside of the German government provide this, independent source of expertise that both firms and the government can work together with and through. And they provide this like independent intermediary between the government and industry that really provides them with, that independence that is so essential, that autonomy that is so essential to good industrial policy, because otherwise you end up in these situations where a very close relationship can form between government and industry, and that's not what you want. You don't want to be too close. But if you're so far apart that you don't have good information from each other, then you're in really big trouble. And I think that's obviously an issue. Olga, what comments do you have about coordination mechanisms, or is there an example of these that you like, or ways in which we can get this collaboration going in a positive direction?
In the industrial sector?
Well, in any sector, I think in any case, yeah.
Someone asked, there is a question about rare materials there. Maybe I use that.
Sure, go for it.
I mean, in some sense, it's quite sensitive as well. And it's something that, lurks in the background, but not always addressed, or very often not addressed directly. But, a lot of consumers, increasingly more consumers are also realizing that, where all those materials that, are in my smartphone come from. And it's not an ethical question. It's also a question about not only ethical question. It's a question about also innovation. It's about incentivizing, I think, what Tillman called, how to incentivize private actors to internalize to some extent the costs of the green transition. But not just to push responsibility towards them and blame them. Oh, you are the bad guys who are using, rare materials that are digged out in the poor countries of African continent or somewhere in Indonesia. It's not the point. The point is that how to also build resilience in my own supply chains. If I'm in Canada and I have companies, importing those rare materials, it's also about my economic sustainability. It's also about, it's in my interest also to contribute to greening international markets, because also to there I will export my own innovative solutions. We worked on a green industrial strategy for Norway, and we put there some bits of imaginative thinking. We tried to look into the future. Norway is a small country, and it's very interesting in terms of challenging it faces, because it earned wealth from petroleum revenues. And then of course the question is how to phase that out if the fossil fuels are associated with the question of national wealth, and something that also Norway was good in terms of keeping and saving that wealth, maximizing that wealth for the future generation. So it's a very complicated question that is particular to that society. And we looked at it, and one way of framing it is that competitiveness of industrial firms of that small economy, that it will making conscious choice and policy push towards green innovation, towards green technological innovation, will open and help that small country become maybe a front mover in certain sectors and certain technologies on the global market. So that should, on a macro level, that can be a good business case if there is a range of policies that will help make that business case for Norwegian companies, for example. So going back to the rare materials, it's the same. I mean, it's just looking at that from the point of view, how can I innovate and structure my policy support measures to incentivize companies to either divert or to minimize, or again, invest and look and scan for some radical innovations happening outside of those smartphone assembling lines, where recovery or reuse of that rare materials can be developed. So that would be my and how do you coordinate? Well, that's of course, it's an important question to ask, but I think that first it's important to agree on why are we doing this? What's the goal?
Yeah, the purpose, as the leader of your institute talks about a lot, is really essential here. That there has to be clarity of purpose. There's to be a very clear target and a clear goal, and everybody has to be on the same page in terms of doing that. One thing that you keep mentioning that that is just really important to me is this idea of there's the things that are going to help might be unexpected. They might not be where you want them to be. They might be in a completely different sector. They might be anywhere. And so I also think of this as being really essential to modern industrial policy in the sense that it's not planning. It's preparing so that you can adapt to the unexpected, which is very different than planning. But if you don't have a very clear goal, if you don't have a very clear purpose, then you can't adapt to those things because you don't even know what's useful when you see it, right? So I think that thinking about the role of accident, the role of lateral connections amongst sectors, this is all really important thinking to do and really important good work to do. I'll give you an opportunity if either of you want to react to my musings here, but I also want to get another question on the table. So I'll read those two questions and then go to each of you, and you can do what you like. So we have two questions about labor, so which I think is really interesting. So Megan asks, how can you merge labor market planning and industrial strategy development to support a just transition? And then there's a second question from Tyler on labor, which says, in terms of labor, can you or should you look at prevailing trends or forecasts of labor, or how do you know what you need to know about labor in order to incorporate labor issues into an industrial strategy? So how do you do labor market planning and industrial strategy at the same time? So if either of you have comments on that, that'd be great. Otherwise, you can go back to the unexpected and the experimental. Tell me, why don't you go first this time?
I think what we have in Germany is this a dual vocational training system, which works pretty well because the whole skills development is really driven by the private sector, or co-driven by the private sector. So especially in the technical branches and in engineering and so on. Most of the education happens in enterprises, and then enterprises and chambers of commerce together provide the certificates, etc. And that creates a proximity between training institutions and firms. No? I think that's a way that essentially nothing gets unperceived in a way, no, because it's a way of really adapting your curricula, etc., very quickly to the needs of the private sector. But and there was another thing that I wanted to mention about purpose. And when Olga mentioned and I talked about Norway, and asked earlier the question, where does Canada want to go? Do you have a vision of where you want to be, right? That reminds me of some work that has been done comparing Norway and Sweden. And that's interesting because Norway is probably a bit like Canada. I mean, Canada is much bigger, but very much a resource-driven economy and with a less diversified economic structure. And Sweden doesn't have the resource rents, but it is very diversified. So if you look at what Norway is good at, it's 3, 4, 5 sectors. No, I mean, they're very good at everything related to oil and drilling and salmon farming and things like that. But there's little what's called economic proximity between these sectors. So the oil drilling sectors don't benefit from the salmon farming, etc. So they have, like, if you have this, I mean, Hidalgo and Hausmann have this economic complexity mapping, no, where they see how many capabilities does the country have. They have basically compared with these Lego toys, no? And if you have a little box of 5 Lego toys, you can build 10 items. If you have a medium box of Lego toys with 20 items, you can already produce 150 things. If you have a big box with 35 items, Lego items, then you can produce infinite things, no? And that's their analogy in a way what capabilities are. So Norway has very much fewer capabilities, much fewer Lego pieces than Sweden has that can be recombined. No? And that's matters. For example, now if we see the green hydrogen and steel decarbonization industries and renewables, etc. Sweden has all these ingredients. They have very good wind parks, wind farms producing at low cost. They have iron ore. They have all the downstream industries. they have steel industries, they have machine tools, they have financial services and everything. So they are now they will be leaders in the race for anything hydrogen and steel making related in terms of no, and Norway doesn't have it, and that has to do with the lack of Lego pieces in a way, no? The lack of diversified capabilities. And the same if you know attract Volkswagen's battery gigafactory to Canada, you will be able to make use of it if you have good chemical companies and membrane companies and software companies. If you don't have them, then you want to, in the long run, that means, do we want to become a specialized resource-driven or remain a specialized resource-driven economy like Norway, which is also rich, right? Or do we want to have these industrial capability at a broad scale and be able to recombine them in the way that the future knowledge economy requires?
Great. Olga, any thoughts on how to integrate labor into industrial policy? Or you can follow up on the question about purpose here.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts, but I need to be brief, I think. There was also a question in the chat on finance. Do you mind, Bentley, if I?
Yeah, we can. That was actually, I was going to go there next. So you can go right there if you like. Yep, that's fine. Do you want me to read the question just so you have it? So there's one question here that says, it'd be helpful to hear more about the specific best practices you come across on financing mechanisms and how to coordinate stakeholders. It's clear to use a variety of support mechanisms, and getting experts on the phone are important considerations, but what else could we take away from learning about financial mechanisms in other jurisdictions? There's also a question about carbon contracts for difference as a potential tool.
And just to say that this is not because I don't think that all matters labor related are not important. It's just because I feel I have more coherent things to say. But there is maybe one footnote. We looked at the global forums of governance and various international organizations, and we look also at the ILO and it is in its role. And of course, it's no one remembers now, but this was the organization that started talking about justice in the transition decades ago. It's not about past 10 years. So the question, but the thing is that I think by now we arrived at the point where when we talk about just transition, it's not just about retraining workers and helping them through various support measures, channeling funds to the areas where that depend on resource extraction. And in seemingly in 10 years, this workers will be out of work. It's absolutely not about that anymore. So of course, it's about more holistic perspective. If I have a certain group of employed people, so what do I do? How do I transfer a skill them? Is there any mobility in my country? If I'm a large country, is there labor mobility between different groups, between different professions? These are all considerations I have to think. It's not about just compensating, people for being out of work or for reducing their employment opportunities. So I think it all boils down then to my education, my training policies, lifelong learning, and many different things. So in that paper, we looked at the role of international organizations, and we concluded that, I think we should, or those organizations that have a very clear social goals, just such as ILO, they should be given stronger role. And should be also explored or exploited by developing countries as well in a more strategic way. I mean, anyway, it's a challenging topic, but I would like to emphasize that it should be given a very serious consideration and being integrated into holistic green industrial policy conversation, I think. On the question of finance, we worked with colleagues at IPP, worked with the British Columbia government. It was a long conversation that resulted in a very long report. It's on the IPP website. But this can be perhaps a Canada-related example of starting a new institution at the local, like province level, right? Invest British Columbia, or however it can be called, a new investment fund or institution that you would like to set up to, let's say, implement a specific set of policies. But then the question again, we made a number of recommendations to the government of British Columbia on how to make sure that this new financial institution is being run with the public purpose in mind. How do you make sure that you really stay? And that's a very tricky question. There is no template that you could copy, you know, from, unfortunately or fortunately. Then you really have to be imaginative and think, where do you want to go? What's my time frame? What's my time horizon? How do I work with, let's say, Business Development Bank of Canada? Can I secure some long-term funding from other funders? How do I combine it with, how do I work with private investors? How do I do any joint financing in the British Columbia through this investment fund? There are again variety of ways. How do I take equity stakes in small companies, either startups, but not necessarily, in British Columbia, and what are conditionalities for my investment fund to go into those deals? How do I manage my portfolio of such projects if I decide to do so? How do I calculate the factor in that some of these, let's say, companies where I hold equity stakes might not be profitable or successful, that will not be successful altogether? How do I distribute it across portfolio? And at the same time, I have to be mindful that I will also reap some of the rewards of these companies where I hold stakes will be very successful. So then my question, how do I distribute these rewards and profits? Do I pay it back to the local government, or do I reinvest it and recycle it within my own investment fund? So a lot of things that are either written in the statutes of such investment institutions with a public purpose, or have a they're not written in the law, but they are part of the managerial decision of that institutions. And of course, from the macroeconomic perspective, then the question, okay, so if I am a Central Bank of Canada and then I am Development Bank of Canada, do I coordinate at all? Do I have a conversation? Do I have a dialogue? If I'm Treasury, where I design various incentive programs for green sectors, is there anything then my central bank is doing in terms of refinancing schemes for these sectors? China is, of course, a great example of such coordination, but I tried to refrain because a lot of things in finance and green finance points to Chinese experience, but of course, we should think in our own national contextual terms.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I shared a link to we shared a link to the report in the chat, so folks can check out the really great work. And I think it's a great summary, both of the thought that you folks have put into industrial strategy more broadly, but also specifically on this financial mechanism. And here in Canada, recently the budget, the last budget announced something called the New Canada Growth Fund, which is a lot like the NBC, the investment corporation in BC that report provides specific advice on, and which aligns with your comments. Which is that the Growth Fund actually has been given a mandate to contribute to the development of net zero supply chains. But the big question is, how are they actually going to deliver on that mandate from their position? And so there's still a lot of details to be sorted out on how that Canada Growth Fund is going to operate, because previous subsidy programs by the Canadian government really were used to fund, decarbonization, but not necessarily integrated into a coherent industrial policy. And they were working across sectors and not really being involved in these targeted missions, which the BC report is very strong on. So lots of lessons for the country to learn from that BC report, which is a really great resource for pushing things forward. So we just have a few minutes left. So I wonder if I just go to each of the panelists and ask if there's any other lessons for industrial policy, just in 1 minute, that that you think that we should really that you should really think about, any threads left unturned here. I'll go to you, Tillman.
No, I don't think I have any additional insights that I haven't said before. I don't know whether any open issues, but I enjoyed this discussion very much, and thank you very much for organizing it.
Thank you, Tillman. Olga, any parting thoughts?
Someone in the chat asked if innovation policy has a role to play in the industrial policy.
Yes.
Absolutely, yes, but I wouldn't even, why we need to think in those silos? What is there? I mean, there are different, obviously, these are different domains in terms of policy tools, but why it has to be that way? Of course, I mean, I think at this point in time, when we don't know where to start, that's my point. In this point in time,
right.
That's why I think using the language of transitions is a little bit more fruitful, because it gives you a lot of space. And then you can start calling things your names, which is relevant for your region and for your country, for your government as well. Of course, then there are other considerations. But there is also, I forgot to mention, Canada Innovation Corporation. And there, I guess yes. I will again go to Sweden, just like Tillman did, although I do think Norway also has a good lesson to teach about financing. But Vinnova is a celebrated example of an organization, relatively small, but being a pioneer and driving systemic change. I think that type of thinking can be implemented like as a thinking, as a philosophy and ethos that organization can adapt. This can be emulated and then translated into your own context. You know, not, I don't want to say quickly and easy, but it's quite valid and feasible. So I guess my conclusion would be on the optimistic side, that I think yeah, we have the tools. We need to think of our capacities and needs locally.
Yeah, that's great. I think that the idea behind the CIC is exactly to look at the Swedish and the Finnish and the Israeli models and try to learn what we can from those about how you can use an innovation agency that's independent to create structural change. So I want to thank you both. I want to thank Dr. Tillman Altenberg and Dr. Olga Makiva for their insights today. This is a really great conversation. And as I said, it's just the first of many conversations that we're hoping to host in this area. So please do jump over to netzeroindustrialpolicy.ca, sign up for the newsletter. And there'll be more of these events, as well as regular digests of insights and reports from things going on in the world where the folks, myself and Derek Eaton and our colleagues at the center will be constantly surveilling international developments and helping to report on them here in Canada. So thank you again to our guests, and we look forward to seeing you all again here soon.